In this Lost Caverns of Ixalan draft meta update, I'll be providing you with all of the most up-to-date information on the format so you can crush your next draft. First up, the format news. And the first headline is, what's good? Blue's good! That's right, powered by incredible uncommons like Spyglass Siren and Zoetic Glyph, as well as gold uncommons like Captain Storm Cosmium Raider and Master's Guide Mural. Blue is absolutely crushing it this format, and even if the commons don't necessarily look exceptional, just keep an eye out for those higher rarity cards because they are really quite good and can power your deck. Next up, caves are a trap. So caves, like Hidden Nursery, which are cards that come into play tapped and give you a little bit of a mana sink later in the game, those are sometimes playable. But what aren't really playable are the cards that care about caves, like Calamitous Cave-In and Forgotten Monument. If there's a card that rewards you for having a lot of caves in play, that really isn't what this format is about. They're not powerful enough to justify putting a bunch of the caves into your deck. So maybe play one or two of the hidden caves, like Hidden Nursery, but stay away from the caves payoffs because they are a trap. Next up is the meta market, and starting things off here we have the archetype rankings. At number 1 is blue-white artifacts, and the reason I just say artifacts is because blue-white can kind of do it all. It can play a more tempo aggro game using blue's flyers along with some artifact synergies, and thanks to Master's Guide Mural, it has a very, very powerful late game even without having any rares. So our blue-white artifacts is the deck of choice for me. It can do really anything you need to do in the format, early game or late game depending on the cards you get. Next is blue-red artifacts, which is more of an aggro-focused deck. This is the deck that really wants to beat down. It wants to pressure your opponent using some of the red aggressive tools, but it is fundamentally still an artifacts deck, so you're still looking for a lot of the same cards. These artifact strategies are quite good. Next up is white-black sacrifice. I really just think that this deck has a lot of synergies going for it. It can flood the board fairly easily, it can use the flooded board fairly easily, and it just has really good removal, which gives you a lot of play against a lot of matchups. It really combats well against aggressive decks because you can use your early removal and your ability to gum up the ground. Just be a little bit careful of flyers and make sure you save your removal for cards that you cannot chump block or deal with on the ground. Next is black-red aggro. This is a deck that has a minor graveyard theme, so like putting cards into your graveyard can matter, but generally you're just going to be playing strong black cards, strong red cards, using your removal spells to push through damage, and I will say that this can get a bit grindier sometimes, but I think it does best when it is leaning aggressive because the red cards tend to be more aggressively slanted this format and not really suited to playing defensive. Next is red-white aggro, a deck that was maybe advertised as more of a mid-rangey shell, but you really just play aggressively with this deck as well. You have some evasive creatures, you have some equipment synergies sometimes, and you can get some flyers from white. Generally speaking, you're going to just want to be attacking your opponent, and then sometimes you'll have a couple of tap synergy pieces, but you're generally just going to be attacking your opponent and tapping your creatures by turning them sideways to hit your opponent. Next is black-green, which is a graveyard strategy. I really think this is one of the best grindy decks in the format because it has really good early creatures that scale up into the late game quite well. And so that's something you're going to be keeping an eye out for is the early creatures that can hold the ground, but then turn on into much better creatures when you have Descend enabled stuff like Basking Capybara and things of that nature, where it's like a 2-mana 1/3 in the early game, but turns into a 4/3 later on. And those are the sorts of cards that really help you bridge the early turns and then fill your graveyard. Eventually, you can get some nice payoffs as well. Next up is blue-black, another graveyard-based deck. The blue cards, a lot of the better ones are tempo-based or flyer-based. And so even though blue is like a really good color, it lends itself better to synergy decks, like the artifact synergy decks versus the ones that want to really go long because its best cards are like flyers and tempo plays. But blue-black graveyard is still a viable deck if you are going to the late game. You can use some card draw elements, you can use some removal spells from black, and you can also just like play high card quality that blue can provide as well. Next is green-white aggro. Green-white is a deck that has a theoretically theme of having buffing your creatures and that mattering, but generally you're just going to want to attack your opponents, play good strong creatures early that can maybe grow to be outsized with equipment or +1/+1 counter synergies or things like that. Fairly straightforward deck. It's a little bit on the lower end of the tier list, but that's just because green is a little bit weaker in this format, and so you're going to want to make sure you have the premium cards, especially because green doesn't necessarily support an aggro strategy as much as being a slower color in the format with ramp and bigger creatures, and so just make sure you have the good early drops from white, and then supplement it with some green combat tricks or just good green-white gold cards. Next is red-green dinos. This is a deck that can function well if you get some good uncommons, because in particular, red-green's gold uncommon, the dinosaur, is quite good at an uncommon level. but you kind of need to have some uncommons to make this deck really work, because if you're just playing like 4-mana, 4/3 dinos that explore, you're going to be a little bit unhappy against the Flyers decks that are just going to bounce your dino, keep hitting you, keep pressuring you. And generally speaking, it just really doesn't do as well in a tempo format, because when you cast like a big dino and have it get bounced or tapped, you're not going to be that happy. And then finally is green-blue mid-range. This is just a card quality deck, which is why I call it mid-range. There's not really that much synergy going on. You just have to have good green cards and good blue cards. It can work. I've seen it work and do okay. But generally, it's not one of those decks that you just get incentivized to play. So if you have a bunch of good blue cards, you're going to look to pair them with white or red usually. If you have some good green cards, you're going to generally be pairing them with like black, or sometimes even just like pairing them with your green cards are generally a little bit on the weaker end, but your blue-green deck's just going to be card quality piles essentially. And so it's a little bit weaker because it doesn't get to benefit from that many synergies. Moving on to the color rankings, and first up, the caveats that I always like to say is that all of the colors are playable, but this is a really good tiebreaker. So if you have the choice between a card in the best color, which I believe is blue right now, simply because blue, as I already said, gets really good uncommons, so you get paid off without having to get good rares. But if you have a choice between a great blue card and a great green card, which as you saw from the archetypes, green's a little bit on the lower end of things, you can just default to the blue card if it's a close pick, because that way you know that down the line, you might get stronger cards. Best does not mean force this, and worst does not mean unplayable. Just pretty much another way of saying the same message that I just illustrated, but in case that first one didn't really stick. Anyway, color rankings, best to worst. Starting with blue, we've already talked about it. Blue just gets really good cards at uncommon. So the commons don't necessarily stand out as being that much better than the other colors, and some of the commons are generally just worse, but you benefit from the uncommons to such a high level that your uncommons can almost function as if they're rares in some situations. And so blue really gets the benefit of that. And that's one of the things that's easy to miss about the colors in the format, is that blue's just uncommons are just absolutely fantastic, including the gold ones. Next are white and red. I kind of have these paired together because both of them pair very, very well with blue. They both kind of can lean aggressively. I have white with the slight edge because I think white does have just some really good late game elements as well. So it can kind of play both ends of the ball, so to speak, whereas red is just more so focused on aggro, which isn't necessarily bad because all of the red cards work well together. But generally speaking, I think that white and red are in a little bit of a close fight for second place. Next is black. Black has really good like individual cards. It's got good removal spells in Deadweight and Join the Dead, and it's also got just like good early creatures as well. But the problem with black is it just doesn't really like go over the top that well, so it can stall the early turns, and then you kind of need some help in order to just guarantee your wins in the late game. And so if you can do that, like black is one of the slower colors, and the format tends to be kind of tempo oriented from my experience. You have to be able to stall the early turns at the very least, and then win in the late game. And sometimes your black decks will stall the early game successfully and then still lose to some like craft cards or stuff in the late game. And so you need to make sure that if you're going to stall the early game with your black deck, you still have a way to go over the top. And then of course there are aggro black decks, but those ones don't necessarily get to benefit from all that black has to offer, other than the removal, which is fantastic. And then finally is green. By no means is green unplayable. As I already said, the colors are not like vastly dispersed. The problem with green is that it just doesn't necessarily have that oomph. It doesn't really thrive in a tempo format where you tap out for your 6-mana dino and then your opponent kills you with a flyer. It also like needs kind of to have a little bit of interaction from the other color because it doesn't really get good interaction. It's got some very solid cards and some bodies that you're really happy to put into play, and I've done well with plenty of green decks, but it is just a little bit weaker if you're trying to play a tempo game. And then in the mid game to late game decks, it's like just playing big creatures isn't always the best strategy, though it can certainly get the job done. So yeah, those are the color rankings. Moving on to the format speed, I would definitely classify this as a fast format, even though you can play some really long, grindy late game battles. And the reason for that is because if you don't do stuff on the first couple of turns of the game, you're going to get absolutely run over by a decent subset of the decks in the format. And sure, that's true in a lot of formats when you face up against aggro, but I think in this format, I've lost a lot of games where it felt like I never got my feet under me and I lost where my opponent just absolutely ran me over. And that's the sort of thing that can happen very, very often in this format if you're not prepared. So I would say no matter what strategy you're drafting, really try to overload on your cheap cards, cheap interaction, cheap creatures, and then once you have been able to stall the game, you want those cards that can kind of scale up into the late game if you are trying to play a longer game. So early game craft cards are really good for this because you play them in the early turns and then they have a craft activated ability later, where if you are able to rush your opponent down, you might not even need the craft ability, but they do give you that inevitability. So I would say it's a fast format, even though you can play some slow games. It's a little bit of a confusing topic because, you know, the games, some of them just last a long time when both players stall out. But if you aren't prepared for the early aggression, you're going to get absolutely crushed, I think. Because I've had a lot of games where I either crush my opponent before they get to do anything, or I spend my turn 1 playing a creature, turn 2 playing a creature, and then on turn 2 they play like a do-nothing artifact, and I just feel like I can't possibly lose those games a lot of the time because it feels like there aren't necessarily the greatest catch-up mechanics until you get to like 6 mana, and by that point you can just be dead. So make sure you prioritize those early plays, and then if you are trying to build a late-game deck, just make sure you have cards that scale into the late game and just do well in the early turns as well, which I'll be covering a couple of those in the Nicolai's Sleepers section. So first up is Oaken Siren. This card looks like it doesn't do much because historically the 2-drops in blue that tap for situational mana abilities aren't the best. Also, 2 mana for 1 power on flyers also isn't always the best. We've seen 2 mana 1/3 flyers before, but this one just kind of does enough little things that it's really worth including. It's an artifact, so it fuels your synergies. It's got flying and vigilance, so it can attack and tap for mana in the same turn. And there are enough artifacts that make this relevant. It'll also tap to activate artifact abilities, which is relevant when you pair it with cards like Waterwind Scout, which make map tokens, because you can attack with your Oaken Siren and then post-combat you can use it to activate a map token, which is really exceptional. Waterwind Scout, by the way, best blue common. Definitely prioritize that card and take it aggressively. It plays great with Oaken Siren, 2-drop Oaken Siren, 3-drop Waterwind Scout, attack them, second main, activate the map. It's really, really good. Oaken Siren also plays well with cards like Clay-Fired Bricks, which are cheap artifacts that have expensive craft abilities, because being able to flip the Clay-Fired Bricks for only 6 mana, essentially with only having to make 6 land drops, is really good. So Oaken Siren pairs well with artifacts, which blue does a lot of artifact stuff. So Oaken Siren is a card that I wouldn't sleep on. I still have been getting these pretty late in my packs, and I think that it's a really nice card. Next up is Another Chance, which is a black card which has been very impressive to me. Just mills you so it can help fuel Descend cards, and then you also get to bring back 2 creatures, which helps you power through those late games. It plays great with Deathcap Marionette, because Marionette is a 2-drop that helps fill your graveyard, gives you options for Another Chance, and is oftentimes a fine card to get back with Another Chance, because on turn 5 or something, you can Another Chance, mill a couple cards, get back Deathcap Marionette and something else that's quite good, and then play the Deathcap Marionette so you don't fall behind on board, because Death Touch is able to trade with your opponent's 5-drops sometimes. Also, it plays great with Echo of Dusk. Echo of Dusk is almost a card that I put as a sleeper, but I knew I could talk about it here. One of the reasons I love Echo of Dusk is because it's the exact sort of card I've been trying to highlight, which is just a solid thing to do on turn 2. You play it, it's a 2-mana 2/2, it trades with your opponent's cards. But then, in the late game, if you have Another Chance in your deck, you can bring back Echo of Dusk as just a 3/3 lifelinker, essentially, for 2 mana, which is really good for stabilizing those late game board states. And if you've gotten down to 4 life or something, you get Echo of Dusk back, put it in play as a 3/3, and you're just in great shape all of a sudden. Also, Another Chance, say you have 3 cards in your graveyard, you can attack them with Echo of Dusk and then play Another Chance at instant speed if you really want to try and trigger the Descend. It is worth noting, if you are going to use Another Chance like that, then you might not be able to bring back both creatures that you milled into your graveyard potentially. So if you're 3 out of 4 on Descend and then you mill 2 permanents and you put 2 permanents into your hand, it's not going to work the way you want, but you can sometimes just bring back 1 creature and then your Echo of Dusk is going to be able to keep those stats. That's just a cool little trick you can do with Another Chance. So another little bit of a synergy thing that you can do sometimes in very niche situations. Also, just Another Chance, get back Echo of Dusk, play it, have a 3/3 lifelinker is just fantastic as well. So you don't need to get too fancy with these cards. Anyway, I have kind of compiled a lot of this information into this little visual graphic that I refer to as a draft cheat sheet. So it's got the color rankings I discussed, the archetype ranks I discussed, the format speed. It's also got some top commons for you to look at. So as I talked about earlier, Waterwind Scout, absolutely fantastic. And then those are some of the top commons from the other colors as well. If you're interested in having a PDF version of that you can download or look at when you're drafting, it's on the NicolaiBolas Patreon. It's absolutely free. You do not need to be a patron to access it. I just put it there because you can't really put PDFs on YouTube, but that is a resource that is available to you as well if you want kind of a condensed version of this draft meta update. And then if you are interested in more stuff, then I do have a full tier list for Lost Caverns of Ixalan on the Patreon as well that you can look into. Anyway, that is going to do it for this draft meta update. Thank you for watching. If you did make it to the end of the video, leave hashtag lost and found, because we were lost in the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, but hopefully we have found our way now that we're a little bit more into the format and have things settled down. That's going to do it for this video, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.